to my channel. I'm Deanna and you're watching Orchie. Today I wanted to make a video about how I'm currently growing my orchids. So as you can see, they're all out in this shade house. Now when you think about your stereotypical orchid, and you talk to maybe strangers about orchids, they mostly will think of the humble Phalaenopsis, right? And that's usually marketed as a house plant, easily grown indoors, and yep, definitely they are lower light orchids and able to tolerate quite low light conditions. And on top of that, they're warm growing plants. They adore hot, humid weather, but they're not really known to love very cold conditions. And at the moment, we are heading into winter here, and basically they're going to be exposed to cold conditions, and also, since they've been moved out, much higher light conditions than they've always been used to. So I wanted to make this video to show you, I guess, their progress, the things that I've learnt so far, and the things that I'm, I guess, a little bit concerned about moving into winter. So I guess for about 6 years now, since the beginning of my orchid journey, I've been growing Phalaenopsis orchids, and I've always grown them indoors in very protected conditions. Generally gotten minimal direct sunlight, and indoors, I guess my coldest conditions that they would have ever experienced is about 16 degrees Celsius, and that's right in the middle of winter. And in 2020, while we were at my old house, I did introduce Mars Hydro grow lights, and that year I had an excellent show. Almost every single one of my Phalaenopsis orchids had a spike during winter, and I think I even made a video about 2 years ago around this time of year counting well over 30 spikes. Then in October 2020 we moved to this house, our new house, and last year with a newborn, all the phals were just in the living room. Very, very suboptimal conditions there, and I had a pretty abysmal show to reflect that neglect and suboptimal conditions. I also had more pest problems. I had quite a few mealybug infestations. Definitely the phals spiked later than they normally would have. Many didn't spike at all. My general flower count was really quite low. I definitely didn't get any multiple spikes. In November last year, that's when I moved all the phals out here into the shade house. So they're all on the lower shelf. You can see there's a shelf above there. We're surrounded by about 70% shade cloth, which also has the benefit of protecting from really, really strong winds. So they've been out here for about 5 months now. So I want to share what I've learnt about outdoor Phalaenopsis growing, with the proviso that it's now autumn here. They haven't been through their first winter out here yet, so there's still really quite a lot for me to learn. And there's also lots and lots to adjust, which I still haven't adjusted. Most of them are still in the same media that they have been for over 2 years, and that is different to what I would prefer them in, because indoors is a very, very different set of conditions to growing them outdoors. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is acclimatization. Outdoor environments are just generally harsher, right, compared to indoors. The temperatures, water exposure, winds, direct sun, and it takes time for any plant to adjust to this change in conditions, especially from much lower light conditions that they were experiencing while they were indoors. But you know, ideally this change, it should be gradual, and it just wasn't for these guys. So if you look at any of these Phalaenopsis orchids carefully, you will find signs of stress. That's both my summer blooming and my winter blooming ones, signs that they've been through quite a lot in the last few months. Some are much worse than others. You can see that's a keiki growing, and the original plant has lost all its leaves. You'll see changes in the colour of the leaves, and almost every single one of these Phalaenopsis lost a leaf or two. You'll see sun damage, water damage, and particularly the smaller Phalaenopsis orchids, the seedlings. They did suffer quite a lot, and I've lost a few of them because they were probably in slightly heavier sphagnum mixes, and also just being younger orchids, they lacked the reserve needed to withstand that change. One good rule of thumb though to follow when you're moving your orchids in terms of the timing of the transition is that you should move your warmer growers, like your Phalaenopsis, in spring, not right in the heat of summer, and your cooler growers in autumn. So not in your coldest or hottest months, but use those transitional seasons. These guys are definitely more likely to transition well into summer than into winter. As for these guys and me moving them in November, well, our harshest summer months are definitely January, February here in Brisbane. Luckily this summer was not really as hot as in previous years. However, it was much wetter. We had so much rain in January and February this year. Overall, let's just say record-breaking years in general are not the best for acclimatizing any plants to outdoor conditions. But you know what? I'm pleasantly surprised that they kind of all did okay. So actually, you know, the main reason that a lot of water is bad for my plants at the moment is because there's still a lot of sphagnum in a lot of these mixes. So I've repotted a few. You can see some of these pots over here have been repotted and they do not have sphagnum in them, but there's lots that still have plenty of sphagnum in them, and the sphagnum just retains a lot of water. So when it's warm, many of the plants are tolerating that okay, you know, especially if there's sort of some sunny days in between. However, coming into winter, the cold, wet roots do not do well. So I guess on that topic of all these pots still having sphagnum in them, let's talk about what the ideal medium might look like. So basically, if you're going to grow orchids in pots outside, the rule of thumb is that you just want a really well draining medium. Now, if your conditions are very humid or wet, then the epiphytic orchids probably will do quite well mounted as well. I haven't mounted any of my plants. That might be a project I can explore in the future, but at the moment that is not something I have on the cards. Phalaenopsis orchids just like being firmly attached to something. So whether that's a pot or a tree, keep that in mind. They do not like wobbling about in pots. Now, I'm currently getting away with the sphagnum because it's been summer. And they've still been able to dry between waterings. Some of my smaller ones, as I mentioned, definitely have struggled with root loss over that period, but I have repotted these ones, as you can see, into my bark, perlite and charcoal mix. But I did prioritize the ones that I thought were not looking that great and that probably wouldn't survive through winter. The trick will definitely be trying to keep them drier, which may not be completely in my control, especially like this week it's been quite rainy. One thing in my favour is that most of our winter days are still actually above 20 degrees Celsius though. So as long as there's sun, hopefully my plants will do okay. But the longer term plan is definitely to get the sphagnum out of all of these pots. Not just the phals, all of these pots have sphagnum in them, and I want that sphagnum gone. But yes, there's only time to do so much with this many orchids and the time that I have. So on the topic of rain and water, let's talk about how I do water these plants. Well, let's talk about what's ideal, because Phalaenopsis orchids, especially like as a rule of thumb, if you're growing them indoors, they do really like a wet dry cycle. I used to say the plants do better if they're allowed to dry, or at least almost dry between waterings. The rain in this shade house is definitely not something I have any control over. If it rains, it gets all the rain in here. There is also a misting system. So those misters are set to go off twice a week. Now, if you have large, well-draining media, there really shouldn't be an issue of too much water. What the plants don't like is their root systems sitting in water. If that water runs through the pot, they tolerate it quite well. The rainwater as well is really good because it's pure. It's really good for flushing out the pots and stuff. The confounding issue here really is that there's sphagnum in these pots. So the sphagnum holds the water against the roots for longer. It can hold a large volume of water, and so it doesn't let those roots dry out if there is sun, say for a day in between the heavy rains. The other issue that will confound these plants is that they are tropical plants and I live in a subtropical climate. It's still a pretty good climate for growing orchids, but it does get cold. So our winters will drop to about 8 degrees Celsius. You know, at the coldest, we see temperatures of like 5-6 degrees right in the middle of winter. Those days, there's probably a handful of them. Very occasionally we'll see it drop below that, but don't think I've ever been in Brisbane and seen it drop below freezing. Yeah, we experience, let's say, mild winters. These guys, they don't like dropping below like 15 degrees Celsius. So they're going to have to tough it out a little bit. And obviously the bigger ones are going to probably tolerate that better than those little ones. So in the beginning, I did have to, I guess, tweak my watering and find that balance. And I did get it wrong at the beginning. So I did have a timer system installed on these misters around October. So it was the same time we did some landscaping around my yard, and the misters were set to go off basically daily for 10 minutes. And I thought that because the days were all over 30 degrees, that they would dry quickly. But I quickly learned that was way too much. Not only did these potted plants not dry adequately between waterings, but I also created an extremely humid environment for a lot of my plants. And if you look at the Vanders, you will see some residual fungal damage on them from those times that I basically overwatered the plants outside here with the misters. So basically I did change the watering. I think maybe in December or January I changed to evening waterings twice a week for 15 minutes. So that's been working really well. Of course there were the torrential rains that I didn't have control over, but I didn't actually change the watering system during that time. Now this week the days are definitely cooler. They're in the mid-20s now, and the nights are below 20 degrees Celsius. So I will be switching this week to early morning waterings for about 10 minutes twice a week. Once the nights drop consistently below 15 degrees Celsius, I am actually going to change this misting system to just go on once a week over winter. So yeah, we'll see how that goes. I'm not saying that's what you should do. That's what I'm going to do, and I'll give you guys an update. Now let's talk about lights. Now I did previously mention that grow lights improved my spiking rate about 2 years ago. And last year, with suboptimal lighting, they didn't bloom well. So it's quite clear to me that light plays a big factor in the health of these plants. Now there's definitely a misconception that phals are low light plants. The fact is, they just won't thrive in true low light conditions. They don't like direct hot light, that's true, but they do appreciate shaded, bright conditions. So, in my opinion, I think the light allows the plant to utilize its nutrient sources and convert that energy to produce more leaves in growth season and more blooms in flowering season. That light just plays a really important overall plant health role. It improves resistance to pests and I guess ultimately successful blooming, which is what you want, right, with your phals. You don't just want the leaves. We grow these plants to see these blooms every year. Now, having said all that, the light in this shade house is really high. It's not direct light because there is 70% shade cloth, but it is much higher than any of these Phalaenopsis were ever used to. Add that to the stress of adapting to the outdoor conditions and how I kept them in the previous year inside the house, fairly well neglected, in less than ideal medium, and these phals have certainly been thrown into the deep end. But the fact is, actually, I haven't lost any of the bigger phals. I have lost a couple, and only a couple, of these smaller seedlings, but they're all surviving. And my feeling is that they're actually enjoying the brighter conditions now that I have some balance. lastly, I just wanted to talk about a couple of miscellaneous things. The first is fertilizer. And you guys will know in my last house I used reverse osmosis water. I measured the TDS. The fertilizing was just a whole process in itself. Now I basically just have zero time to fuss about fertilizing. So I use slow release fertilizer. I have an automatic misting system and that's connected to tap water. I use slow release fertilizer pellets because otherwise these plants just would not get fertilized at all. So my theory is it is just better than nothing and they're getting some nutrients. Now in an ideal world I would actually also apply seaweed and CalMag and I don't know, whatever other fun things, but those, especially calcium, it's probably the big thing that's missing. I do think there's a little bit of calcium in that slow release fertilizer, but I definitely think that calcium is an important nutrient that they would probably get a bit more benefit out of. So that's probably something that I will apply in spring, but for now these guys are approaching flowering season, so I won't bother, not that I have time anyway. On that note, you can actually see signs of some nutrient deficiencies. So they do call this sort of patterning chlorosis. I don't know a huge amount about nutrient deficiencies, but I think, calcium, magnesium deficiencies can cause changes in leaf color. I think calcium deficiency can cause like a dieback at the leaf tips, but this looks a little bit like magnesium deficiency from what I know. When you get like a mottling sort of appearance in the leaf colors, that there can be some nutrient deficiencies. That may not actually be that it's not being applied. Sometimes it's because when the roots are also stressed, when the plant's stressed, it has a lot more difficulty absorbing those nutrients, and that would have played a factor as well. Now the other thing about growing plants outdoors is, whether you grow them indoors or outdoors, there's always going to be pest exposure. In general, the pests like scale, mealybugs and all that haven't been a problem at all for the phals, but there have been insects like caterpillars that I found taking a good nibble out of some of these leaves. So over the summer months I did have to apply both some insecticide and pesticide out here, but definitely, January especially tends to be the peak month for pests. Whether I'm growing inside or outside, just seem to rear their ugly head around that time, spring, summer. Well everyone, I wanted to finish this video off by showing you a few spikes. Some of them are a lot more established, some of them are just beginning to poke out, and especially in the last week or so I've noticed quite a lot of little spikes emerging. So it's a chance to see some of the very, very early spikes and what they look like. I did make a video a couple of years ago on how to differentiate spikes and roots, and that goes into a lot of detail about the very, very early little nubbins and how to tell the difference. So I will put a link to that video up above, but I've had to grab the orchids out from the positions that they were in because it's actually really hard to get down there and show you the spikes, and it's pretty hard on my back. It is a few days later from when I originally filmed the first segment, and I tried to film this yesterday actually, but Maisie was with me, and if you guys stick around to the end, there's some pretty cute little reels of how it was quite impossible to film with Maisie, so I've learnt my lesson. So we'll start over here and just have a look at some of the newest spikes that are emerging. So this is phals. You can see a little spike emerging over here. You can see the sharp little mitten shape that comes out. And this is Phalaenopsis red sesame with a spike just down there. We've got my no ID. I've named this one Tropical Punch. I've had this, mini phal for quite some time, but you can see it didn't fare too well with the caterpillars this season, so it's had a huge chunk taken out, and it did actually lose a couple of the bottom leaves as well as soon as we brought it out. Here's some more caterpillar damage. I didn't know caterpillars would like the phals so much, but I guess they're very thick, juicy leaves, so here you go. This is Fuller's Black Leopard, and can you guys see that down there? Let me see if I can zoom in a bit more. That is a little spike developing down there. And over here we've got one that I've named Madam Butterfly, one of my earlier phals as well. And she used to be a really big phal, but had a few tough years, didn't spike for a while, but this is one that Jared got for me actually. Maybe it was our anniversary. Reduced to quite small leaves now, but I know this is actually a big phal. And here we've got another, no ID, but this one is named after my Sebastian. So it's actually doing quite well. You can see the old flower spike is still green where I cut it. If we peek inside here, we've got one new little spike just emerging. Can you see there? Zoom right in for you. So this one has just very simple white flowers, and my friends got me this when Sebastian passed away a few years ago. And got a few more over here. Here's a little spike developing on, I think this is the keiki from my keiki separation video. The mother plant is not doing as well. It got quite stressed when we moved it out here. I think I've lost tags, and I'm not sure if I ever tagged this one properly, but the keiki has always done very well. We've got Phal Chin Ching Rose Parade here with a new spike developing there. And on this one, this is a no ID that I got towards the end of last year. And I'll show you something that I've never actually seen before on a phal. And you guys will have to tell me if you've ever seen this before. But you can see there's a couple of old spikes there that have been cut off. Now, can you see that? That is a new spike developing. It's developing below the other spikes that have been cut. I always thought that new spikes work their way up, and I'm pretty sure that's the usual thing that happens. I'm not sure if this is an anomaly or if this is something that other people have noticed before, but let me know. Yeah, really, really interesting. So I've got a spike developing on that one. Otherwise, we've got some more established spikes here. Here's one on my Papayago. We've got a spike developing on Stella, no ID, from my grandma, named after my grandma's sister, actually. If we move across, I've got Jimi Hendrix here with some gorgeous secondary spikes offshooting from the main spike there. We've got this phal developing a spike, early days yet. This one is Lorraine. I named her after my grandma, so it's really special that this one's spiking now. And so go Vivian with variegation coming back into the leaves, which is awesome. And it's got beautiful big spike developing. If we move across here, I know Mabel's got a spike. There we go. Developing nicely. Another spike here on Ching Ching Smile Kitty. You see that coming through? Down here I have noticed a little spike, teeny tiny one. If you can see that, developing on Phal Allura Sunlight. It looks definitely a little worse for the wear, so I'll see how it goes developing this spike, but I might have to cut it for the sake of the plant. And my Doretius is in bloom, so the Doretius tend to be summer bloomers. This is the first spike for this one. Just do a little close up of her flowers. So pretty. And last but not least, just saw a peek of, this is Sogo Euclidean. I didn't notice a spike on her the other day, but there's a new spike developing on that one and this one. Last but not least, the phal that's probably the furthest along in terms of spikes and blooming, already blooming, is Phal Allura Paradise. And just look at those gorgeous flowers. The colour's spectacular, but what's even more awesome, because I usually get a shortish sort of spike with usually less than 10 flowers, but I've got a second spike developing, and look at all the branches. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 extra branches off the main flower stem there. Now, I've never had a blooming like that at all, so I think that these plants are ultimately enjoying the light. Perhaps the added stress has played a factor in more proliferative blooms, maybe, but I think it does have a lot more to do with the light than anything else. Isn't that pretty? Anyway guys, stick around and I'll show you a few reels of what I had to go through with Maisie while I was trying to film yesterday. I hope you guys all have a fantastic week and happy growing until I see you next time. Bye! A few days later, I have a little additional star for the show here, mixed in with some summer bloomers like the Doritas, so the DTPS, maybe a little bit more confused. Maisie, are you pulling out the tags again? Yes, Maisie. How many tags have you pulled out now? Several. Maisie, be careful. Watch your head. Maisie, where are you going? Oh dear, I might have to continue this video another day again. I do believe little miss has done a poopy. A little poopy nappy. Yeah. Look at all the tags.